Hello, welcome to NovaraLIVE. Coming up tonight, Trump has threatened that a whole civilization will die if his demands to Iran are not met. Sina Toosi explains what winning would actually look like for Tehran. US and Israeli forces have bombed a synagogue, and the BBC have made an eyebrow-raising correction to their reporting on the war. I'm Bastani, and tonight I'm joined by Kieran and Andrieu. Kieran, how are you?
I'm very well, Aaron. There's a striking disjunction between the beautiful weather outside and the kind of threats and rhetoric from the US president that we're going to be discussing today. How are you in the face
I
of
am
all
very
that?
good. It's true. There is a strange relationship between gorgeous weather outside, spring is here, finally, and a maniac in the White House potentially catalysing a nuclear war. Before we start our show tonight, if you fancy winning £50 to spend in our merch shop here at Novara Media, we've got 5 to give away, but there's only 6 days left to enter. All you need to do to get that £50 voucher is to complete the audience survey for Novara Media by 11:59 p.m. Sunday, not 1 minute late, on the 12th of April, to be in with a chance of winning. That's this Sunday for all of you guys watching live. I said it last week, but we're really about to make a huge leap here at Novara Media. There'll be more on that soon. But to get that right, to help us make a new media for different politics, we need your feedback. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to understand exactly who you are, who makes up the NovaraLIVE audience, what matters to you, what do you think we could be doing better or worse. In the past year alone, hundreds of thousands of new people have joined us here on YouTube. They've subscribed, they've supported us. It doesn't matter if you've just discovered us, whether you've been with us for a few months or really long term, a few years, your feedback is invaluable. So to do that, follow the link in the description below or head to novara.media/survey to complete it. Like I say, you could win £50 worth of t-shirts, tote bags, books, whatever you want. Lots of great stuff at our shop. The future of the world could hang in the balance this evening, and it turns on a single question. Will US President Donald Trump taco, always chicken out, or will he stand by his threat to obliterate Iran's civilian infrastructure if the Strait of Hormuz is not reopened by 8 p.m. Eastern Time tonight? That was a promise Trump made on Sunday, but it escalated dramatically today with Trump posting this. A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. I don't want that to happen, but it probably will. However, now that we have complete and total regime change where different, smarter and less radicalized minds prevail, maybe something revolutionarily wonderful can happen. Who knows? We will find out tonight. One of the most important moments in the long and complex history of the world, 47 years of extortion, corruption, and death will finally end. God bless the great people of Iran. I'll repeat that. A whole civilization will die tonight. Not a government, not a political regime, not some people in charge of something, an entire people, an entire history, an entire culture. The US is a nuclear power, and it's Donald Trump who is dangling his finger over the button. There's never been a time in history where a person of such power, backed by the arsenal to carry out such a threat, has promised genocide against the people so explicitly. This isn't some negotiating tactic. The threat alone is terrorism against a country of over 90 million people. And Trump's genocidal ally, Israel, is already making good on it. This morning, they published this warning to Iranian civilians. Urgent warning to users and train passengers in the country of Iran. Dear citizens, for the sake of your security, we kindly request that from this moment until 9 p.m. Iran time, you refrain from using and traveling by train throughout Iran. Your presence on trains and near railway lines endangers your life. That was published by Israel Online, and they've since begun carrying those attacks out. In its Telegram military channel, the Israeli military confirmed that it had struck 8 bridge and railway sections. It claims they were used by the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, to transport weapons and military equipment. One of them was in Karaj, where rescue workers were filmed rushing to attend to the victims after an explosion hit railway tracks. Other strikes have been reported in Tabriz, Kashan, and Qom, all major cities surrounding Tehran. Trains from the second city of Mashhad have all been cancelled in response to a threat to that line, suggesting an attempt by Israel and the US to disconnect Tehran from other regional hubs. Large fires were also filmed coming from the direction of Tehran's airport, Mehrabad Airport, a crucial piece of civilian infrastructure, adding credence to the suggestion that Tehran is being isolated. Of course, Israel is no stranger to indiscriminate attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in Gaza and the rest of Palestine. On Fox News, Israel's ambassador to the UN justified his country's assault in Iran.
According to international law, if the other side is attacking civilian targets, you are allowed to retaliate. And we are seeing in the last few days that they continue to target civilian targets in Israel, in the Gulf, airports, hotels. So we have a legitimacy to target those civilian targets. And I would advise the Iranian to believe President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, because they have showed in the last month that they are capable of striking any target in Iran. And now we have to wait whether they will continue to play the game with the Strait of Hormuz. It's what they are doing there. It's beyond imagination. They'll blackmail. They actually collect money from countries in order to allow them to use the straits. We shouldn't allow this piracy 2026 to continue.
It's important to remember, because they'll lie to you constantly about this, that the United States and Israel attacked Iran unprovoked at the end of February. Schools, hospitals, and cultural sites were all hit in the very first days, including one school where over 100 schoolgirls were killed. That was on the first day of this illegal war. Strikes have also been reported today on Karg Island, where Axios reports the US has struck, quote, military targets. Of course, 8,000 people live there. That's very rarely mentioned. It's probably worth remembering. In March, Trump said the US had already bombed, quote, every military target on Karg Island. If that's true, then what is now under attack is Iran's energy infrastructure, including potentially the 30 million barrels of oil the country stores on the island alongside its main export terminal. According to semi-official Iranian news agency Tasnim, ordinary Iranians are now also objecting to the US and Israel's plans to kill their civilization, in Trump's own words. Iranian media reports that civilians are forming human chains around crucial Iranian infrastructure like power stations and bridges, including here at the Kazarun power plant. This footage, posted online, also appears to show Iranians forming a human chain across the White Bridge in Avaz in southwestern Iran. And Al Mayadeen reports students gathering on the 1,700-year-old Dezful Bridge, an iconic bridge, in response to Trump's threat. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard has also responded to Trump's genocidal threats. The IGC said it, quote, will not hesitate to retaliate against despicable aggressions on civilian facilities. It has warned that in response to any further attacks, they, quote, will inflict such damage on the infrastructure of the US and its partners that they will be deprived of the region's oil and gas for years to come. That, of course, is in reference to the Gulf states. Iran has already managed to inflict massive damage to the global oil supply, a damage that still hasn't been fully felt. Today, the International Energy Agency's chief, Fatih Birol, said the current oil and gas crisis is worse than those of 1973, 79, and 2022 put together. 1973 was a huge deal. 79, of course, was partly in response to the Iranian Revolution, and then the ensuing Iran-Iraq war in 2022 was as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war. So 73 and 2026, both fundamentally global energy crises being catalyzed by Israel, worth thinking about. For those who don't know, the 1973 crisis ended an unbroken period of Western prosperity following the Second World War, and it plunged the region into its fastest economic contraction since the Great Depression. The 1979 crisis led to recession, inflation, political turbulence, and the devaluing of several currencies that led fundamentally to a political revolution with Thatcher and Reagan. And of course, we all remember 2022 and the energy shock that led to a cost of living crisis we're all still feeling. I think in Britain, people actually got poorer in real terms to the greatest extent since the mid-1950s. The British government has already quietly acknowledged the shock that lies ahead. It has now capped student loans interest rates at 6% from September, explicitly acknowledging the economic shocks of the illegal US-Israel war on Iran ahead. The worst is very much yet to come, and they're trying to get ahead of that story. Other countries have begun to warn of the precipice we're now standing on. This was Qatar's foreign ministry spokesperson at a press conference today.
Do you have any reason to be confident that this crisis can be diffused before it's too late?
Well, first of all, we were trying to diffuse the escalation in the region since 2023. We had been warning since 2023 that escalation left unchecked will get us into a situation where it cannot be controlled. And we are very close to that point. And this is why we have been urging all parties to find a resolution out of this, to find a way of ending this war before it spirals out of control. Right now, I don't think Qatar can offer any answers to your questions. The only thing we can do is to say that all of us in the region have always had a very clear position around this. The infractions on our sovereignty by Iran cannot be explained or justified in any way. The continuation of this war in this way will only mean more costs for the people of the region, for the international peace and security, for international economy, for international energy markets. And there are no winners in the continuation of this war. There are only losers, and the net of losers is expanding every day as a result of the ramifications of the economic situation.
Isn't it funny? You have a Qatari politician, spokesperson talking about their sovereignty. Qatar hosts 2 US military bases. And of course, the US military is attacking Iran. So Iran is retaliating to a country that's hosting bases to the country that's attacking it. I think most people would do that, or at least they would understand it. But apparently not. Apparently not. Apparently this is just crazy and makes no sense, and these are infringements on our sovereignty. But the American air bases aren't infringements of anything, actually. Or when Israel blew up a building in Doha because there was a meeting of Hamas there, also in Qatar, I suppose that was less of a big deal, right? Personally, I think that's a much bigger infringement of sovereignty than anything Iran is doing. Iran is, I think, engaging in national self-defense. You can call me what you like, but this war was unilaterally started by Israel and the United States. There are US bases in Qatar, very close to Iran, very, very close. Go look on a map right now. Neighboring Iran, I don't think it's that irrational. Like I said, it's perfectly explicable. And before I go to you, Kieran, I just want to say this. We talked about the train lines in Iran being destroyed. The Qom-Tehran train line is a high-speed rail link. They're destroying high-speed rail links. Isn't this something? Think about this for a moment. America literally can't build high-speed rail. It's tried. It's spent tens of billions of dollars in California to build high-speed rail. It can't. What it can do is destroy high-speed rail. You have a country capable of bombing high-speed trains but not building them. I feel like that's a really extraordinary distillation of where the American body politic is in the 2020s, and actually where American empire is. Kieran, what do you make of these threats from Trump with regards to destroying Iranian civilization?
Well, Trump said, remember, very recently that he's not constrained by international law, he's constrained only by his own morality. And now we see very clearly where that leads. It leads to everything up to and including the possibility of nuclear Armageddon. I don't know whether this will be our Cuban Missile Crisis or whether it will be another serving of taco. But either way, what is our Prime Minister doing? Our Prime Minister is tweeting about Wireless Festival and Kanye West. Another sign that ours is a completely irrelevant vassalage. I mean, nothing says managed decline or unmanaged decline quite like ignoring the possibility of nuclear Armageddon and instead tweeting about Wireless Festival. I think it's very easy to get... Actually, one more thing. A civilizational war is being threatened here on the basis of achieving something which was already the status quo at the beginning of the war, i.e. opening the Strait of Hormuz. I know that that's it's sunken into our assumptions, but I think it's worth restating how absurd that is. A civilizational war is being threatened against a country of 93 million people to achieve something that was already in play before the war, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Danny Danon, the Israeli spokesperson there, saying, can you think of anything more shocking? They're collecting tolls on the Strait of Hormuz. Well, I agree with you. Iran has a right to self-defense. This was a unilateral or bilateral Israel-American war of aggression. on Iran. Of course, they were going to close the Strait of Hormuz to the best of their ability. And of course, the best of their ability is actually quite good. And they should have known that. The risk assessments around this war, which obviously weren't done in any kind of strategic way or proper way, should have captured that very clearly. Finally, I just want to, before I go back to you, Aaron, I just want to say one more thing. It's easy to get lost in the source here. But I think let's just briefly restate why we're in this utterly catastrophic and absurd position. Catastrophic both militarily and economically. And also, just for a good measure, few lashings of the theatre of the absurd with what I mentioned about the Strait of Hormuz. We're here because we're living in a nightmare of Israeli statecraft, which is to say the logic of Israel's addiction to war and colonization. We're here because Trump wants to create an intercontinental red herring to distract everybody from the allegations that he's engaged in sexual acts with minors. And we're here, contingent on those two, because pro-monarchist Iranians seem to think that the butchering of their own people is a price worth paying for the restoration of their power. And then, of course, those are the causes, but now the war has its own momentum. It has its own logic, which looks increasingly, day by day, more like a death spiral.
I think this is really important to say. It's not mentioned nearly enough. And this is in no way apologism for how Russia is waging its illegal war in Ukraine, which is also a war of aggression.
Yeah.
What Israel and the US are doing to Iran and civilian infrastructure, schools, energy, water desalination is, from what I understand, a whole other level above anything Russia has done. But of course, Russia is kicked out of UEFA and FIFA. Its football teams can't participate in international competition. If you say the same about Israel, of course, you must be an anti-Semite. Donald Trump's statement today about the entire Iranian civilization dying tonight is probably the most extreme thing he's ever said, which is really saying something. It may be the most extreme thing any US president has ever said. And again, that's really saying something. Of course, you have to take it seriously. Trump is the most powerful man in the world, and he's very well armed. But he's also someone who likes to chat a load of cobblers.
We are a partner with Venezuela, and we've taken hundreds of millions of barrels, hundreds of millions. Over 100 million barrels already is in Houston, refined and out, and paid for that war many, many times over, many times. You know, the old days, to the victim, okay? You know that. To the winner belong the spoils. The people of Venezuela, they say if I ran for president of Venezuela, I'm polling higher than anybody has ever polled in Venezuela. So after I'm finished with this, I can go to Venezuela. I will quickly learn Spanish. It won't take too long. I'm good at language. We went to NATO. I didn't ask very strongly. I just said, hey, if you want to help, great. No, 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 we will not help. I said, that's all right. You don't want to help? Because I've always said NATO's a paper tiger. See, NATO's a paper tiger. Putin's not afraid of NATO. Putin's afraid of us, very afraid of us. And he's explained it to me a lot of times. I got to know him very well. I know him very well. NATO's a paper tiger. NATO is us. When you add that to it, but we have to find that leaker because that's a sick person. Probably didn't realize the extent of how bad it was. I can't imagine that the person did, but we're going to find out. It's national security, and the person that did the story will go to jail if he doesn't say.
Those clips were from Trump's press conference last night. And as you saw, he was advocating piracy in Venezuela while suggesting he could be the next president, telling the world Russian President Vladimir Putin is manipulating him over NATO, and threatening to jail US journalists for protecting their sources. When anybody says things like Trump does say with such, world historic importance, the insinuation of tactical nuclear weapons being deployed. That's just the insinuation. People say, well, you shouldn't take them too seriously. It could be TACO. It's easy to say when you don't live in Iran, right? But if you're an Iranian and you have somebody who is in charge of the world's most powerful country with the second largest reserve of nuclear weapons, and he's talking like that, and you've already seen a school with over 150 kids that's been blown up, water desalination, petrol, energy, the biggest steel factory in West Asia been destroyed. It seems actually like a not rational, because it's never rational, but it's a predictable escalation, isn't it?
It is a predictable escalation. And this is the part of the death spiral that I was referring to a minute ago. I think enough has been done to Iran for Iranians to not be concerned about the future, to know that they are being pummeled by two very powerful militaries, of course, the US predominant in that power or preponderant in that power, pummeled, as I say, a bilateral act of aggression by those two countries, and that worse may very well come to pass. And it must feel akin to having a giant piano hanging over your head by a tiny thread all the time, if you're Iranian. It's a menacing thing. And this is always the challenge with Trump, isn't it? You know, where does the pearl clutching about his cognitive decline end and the actual threat of the reality of Trump begin? And disentangling those two things is quite a challenge. But I think we have to take seriously at this point that anything is on the table. Anything is possible with somebody who is clearly in cognitive decline and also extremely megalomaniacal and probably deranged.
Well, he is 80 in June or July, I think June. He's getting on. So the idea of cognitive decline, I don't think is in any way unfair, just by virtue of what he's saying, but also the fact he's going to be 80 soon. Also the fact that he is, I think, a narcissist. The combination of those two things is really significant. But it's not just the threat over Iranians, and of course that's the main thing. It's the rest of us too. You know, you have Labour and the government, good, trying to get ahead of, I think, very high inflation in the months ahead by capping student loans at 6% in terms of the interest rate. Right now, that doesn't really make much difference. But of course, if inflation goes to 10% and interest rates go up, this is going to save people a lot of money, actually. We know that from 2022, 2023, it had a huge knock-on to student loans and the interest rates and the increased amount that people therefore owed afterwards. You have people like Ben Leo at GB News saying, Trump just talks rubbish. Just sit back, enjoy the ride, eat some popcorn. Obviously, again, Iranians can't afford, literally his words, Iranians obviously can't afford to do that. But actually, nor can many people in this country. If you're going to remortgage in 6 months and interest rates have gone up 1%, you're paying an extra couple of £100 a month as a result on your mortgage. That's not enjoying any ride. And of course, that's nothing compared to what people in Iran are having to undergo, but still. Or if you're a business and you're having to refinance a loan that you took out and the interest rate is higher, you might go under. And you combine that with high inflation, maybe fewer people are buying your goods and services, you might not have a business anymore. You might have to lay people off. There's no ride to enjoy here for anyone, actually, maybe with the exception of Israel, certainly not the American consumer. I mean, it's crazy in so much as this is one of the very few conflicts where genuinely everybody is losing. I mean, maybe even Israel too. If they keep on getting walloped, maybe even Israel too. It's certainly accelerating the demise of any international support for that country. Let's have a look at some international and domestic responses to Trump's comments about destroying Iran. This was Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney.
This morning, President Trump posted on Iran saying, a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. What's your message to Trump, and do you believe this rhetoric?
The first is that Canada expects all parties in this conflict, in any conflict, to respect international laws, the rules of engagement, and that means not targeting certainly civilians or civilian infrastructure. And we urge all parties in this war to follow those responsibilities. It's a point we've made publicly and privately. There is I'll just observe that there are some negotiations going on, and that there is often a gap between what's said publicly and what's happening privately. We are not at the center of those negotiations, although we have some visibility to them. However they unfold in the coming hours, in the coming days, the coming weeks, those negotiations, those discussions, those movements, as it must towards a cessation of hostilities and a reestablishment of security and peace in the region, those international responsibilities, those humanitarian responsibilities remain for all parties throughout that period.
In the US, Democratic leader Chuck Schumer said this. This is an extremely sick person. Each Republican who refuses to join us in voting against this wanton war of choice owns every consequence of whatever the hell this is. And by the way, Chuck Schumer is not a radical. Meanwhile, the UN Security Council met to discuss a resolution brought by Bahrain that would authorize military action to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. That escalatory proposal was vetoed by China and Russia. So what about Britain? What has our government been doing to de-escalate the situation that's brought us to the brink of a nuclear war, potentially, maybe even World War III? Well, posting online today, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer made this vital contribution. Kanye West should never have been invited to headline Wireless. That's a festival, by the way. This government stands firmly with the Jewish community, and we will not stop in our fight to confront and defeat the poison of anti-Semitism. We will always take the action necessary to protect the public and uphold our values. I can see it now. The nuclear aftermath, as I'm sitting in Portsmouth, that's pretty high up on the target list of targets, right? It's been nuked. Faslane's been nuked. London's been nuked. There's my wife and I. We've just survived. Darling, don't worry. Kanye West isn't doing Wireless this year. Fear not. The major problem has been addressed by our fantastic government. I should add, there's been nothing from our Foreign Minister, Yvette Cooper, either. I mean, if you're calling NATO a paper tiger, what the hell are the correct words for the British government right now?
Protoplasmic jellies. Zero spine. I don't know if that's the correct word. But the backbone of a chocolate eclair, as Teddy Roosevelt once said of one of his rivals. I mean, it's astonishing how irrelevant. Repeat what I said earlier, or at least expand on it. There is no quicker way to make yourself irrelevant than to make your country appear a vassalage and in interminable decline than to not have an opinion on something as serious as this. And this government's complete inability to say or do anything that they fear might create consternation in Washington is one of the most contemptible things about it. There are many contemptible things about this government, but that is, I think, right up there with the foremost of them. And I don't really expect anything else. That's the tragic thing. I don't really expect them to do anything other than to tweet about Kanye West, try and create a distraction using Wireless Festival, which I don't think has been culturally relevant even in the UK since about 2005. I mean, if it were Glasgow, maybe. No, it's really risible. It's tragic.
It's terrifying. I mean, this was the world's most powerful country till 100 years ago. Think about it. It's quite extraordinary. And history books, well, when World War III was breaking out, the British Prime Minister was talking about Kanye West, and it wasn't about a little Luther Vandross or a little Aaliyah. It was about his free speech. And by the way, lots of people are saying, this is outrageous. How could he not be allowed to come to the UK? Personally, free speech, I think Kanye West should be here. But in the context of a country being nuked, I don't really care, actually. I don't really care. It's not really an important story. Yeah. The principle, I'm happy to talk about that. You want my position, I'll tell you. I don't care. You know, it's like somebody stabs you and you've got, puncture wounds all over your chest, think I'm about to die, and then, maybe you've got an earache. The earache's still there, but maybe you're not going to notice it very much because actually more important stuff's going on. We're now over a month into the Iran war, and nobody really knows how this thing is going to play out. One thing that is certain, however, is that the war itself has seismically changed the politics of Iran internally and in a plethora of ways, some of which are visible, others less so. Earlier today, I spoke to Sina Toosi, a senior fellow at the Centre for International Policy. I began by asking him what Donald Trump meant by his threat to destroy Iranian civilization.
It makes me think of, and this is probably not how Trump is thinking about it, but like Samuel Huntington's thesis of Clash of Civilizations. But at the root of that, there is amongst this class in America, among the ruling class of America and among the foreign policy establishment and amongst American hardliners, that this idea of, they are supreme, they are, it's a supremacist ideology, and they do view things in these kind of racist terms, and that's long been the case. I mean, if you dig into the history of US foreign policy, at roots, there is an element of white supremacy, and uncompromising dominance and hegemony over the world. So Trump is really just the most brazen, naked form of that, in my opinion. Trump is someone who, maybe American foreign policy has long been aggressive, interfering in other parts of the world, toppling governments, doing, many of these things that he threatens, now, and he's doing now. But the difference is Trump is just so much more explicit about it. Whereas even, the Bush administration or Paul Wolfowitz, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, I mean, they weren't that different ultimately in their war on terror and their kind of, what underpinned that war, the kind of neoconservative ideologues who justified that war, people like Bernard Lewis. And, at the root of that is this idea of, racial supremacy, that the Islamic world is something that is inferior. So I think that's how I just initially, to your question, that, just off the top of my head, and, for Trump, that plays to his base, I think, for Trump, we've seen that he is someone who, when he came onto the political stage on a national level in 2016, it was all, he was a demagogue. He was someone who, castigated Mexican Americans in Mexico and talked in all these racialized terms and, said, this rhetoric is not new for him. It's like they're sending their, rapists and murderers. They're not sending their best, about Hispanics and Latin Americans. So this is his politics. His politics is of demonizing others, scapegoating others, and, kind of white working class grievance. It used to be, but now it's more like this kind of elitist, I would say probably white ruling class, or, I mean, we can dig into that, but, there's obviously this war is not serving the interests of the work, anybody amongst the middle and working classes in America, I would argue. So he's really betrayed some of those electoral promises that he had given in the past.
You've said that Iran isn't backing down. What does winning look like for Iran in this conflict? What would be the settlement where actually Tehran and the IGC say, yep, you know what, we're stopping. We're not going to attack Saudi anymore. We're not going to attack the UAE anymore. What are their key red lines?
The policy that preceded this war, that this war occurred in the context of, was this maximum pressure campaign against Iran that was openly aimed at destroying the economy. We know, according to the economic data and great research that has been done, that millions of Iranians have fallen out of the middle class since 2018, have fallen into poverty. There's been, at times, shortages of medicine. The currency has greatly depreciated. So this has been, Iran has been in that economic penalty box for a long time now. And Iran has also been in the box of having the threat of war hanging over it, which has obviously had debilitating economic effects, and has created this atmosphere where for the longest time, Iran was in a state of neither war nor peace. So there was this kind of covert war, hybrid war being waged against it. There was the June war, followed by this 7-8 month period of high tensions, a threat of war again. And Iran can't have economic development that it needs under these circumstances. So when it comes to what kind of end state Iran is looking at towards this war, is to come out of this box, come out of this penalty box that it's been in, the economic warfare, the threat of war dangling over it. So right now we're seeing that in these proposals and counter proposals that are being reported in the media, the Iranians are saying that they don't want a temporary ceasefire. They want a permanent end to the hostilities. They want an end that could bring them an economic horizon, that they can emerge from this war, not like 1991, Saddam Hussein's Iraq after the Gulf War, which, the Iraqi regime survived that war, but it was just under immense economic sanctions after that. There was a no-fly zone over much of the country, and it really laid the stage for another war down the line that destroyed the country even more. So they, their calculation in this war, and, I'm reading Iranian strategists every day, kind of their media there, trying to get an idea of what they're saying, is that, the Strait of Hormuz is their key leverage here, that they've had, it has given them a means to pressure the US and the global economy in a way that they never had before. Whereas previously, US threats against Iran would have these debilitating effects on its economy. They would depreciate the value of the rial, the Iranian currency. Now we're in a scenario where Trump has to placate the markets during the week, try to talk about diplomacy, to prevent, the stock market from sharply declining, from oil prices from sharply increasing. And so this is a scenario, this is a kind of situation that Iran is trying to preserve, that it's shown this capability to disrupt the Strait of Hormuz, and that if this war ends without Iran losing this capability, and I can get into the scenarios how this war can end, but if it ends with this capability still being there, and if it's on Iran's terms that ships are then going, then Iran will have shown that this is a leverage that it holds, and that in the future that could negate the risk of war again. That if in the future Netanyahu or Trump threatens Iran or tries to move towards military action, we'll immediately start seeing these negative market effects and economic knock-on effects. And they threw everything they had at Iran, and they couldn't stop this closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So that in itself can usher in a new regional order where, the Gulf states, other neighboring countries will, for their own interests, have to accept a situation where they have to work with Iran, that they have to engage with Iran. And then, ultimately the Iranian goal is to tie its stability and its prosperity to the stability and prosperity of the Persian Gulf. And so that is the conclusion that they're looking for. Now, Trump is kind of in a strategic deadlock where, he had this regime change ambition. He hit a wall against that. Now the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted and closed, and there's no real military option, I would argue, for that to be ended, because Iran has the entire northern coastline of the Persian Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz is very narrow, and all it takes, this isn't a closure that Iran has been hitting every tanker, that Iran has been mining the Strait or mining the Persian Gulf. It could reach there, but it is a closure based on the risk analysis and risk aversion of the tanker companies, of these local economies, that if there's the mere risk of getting hit by an Iranian missile, that there's the mere risk of hitting a mine, that they're not moving those ships, and that has been effective, and the Strait is de facto shut down. And so that is something that Iran is going to be able to hold despite massive military escalation. So Trump right now, because he's hit a wall, he's threatening all these insane threats, civilization ending. But, even if he escalates to that level, Iran has thousands of these Shahed drones and other kind of drones, these deeply entrenched missile facilities. So it can keep up that pressure on the Strait of Hormuz, I would argue, indefinitely, most likely.
So imagine we're in a negotiation, Sina, and, I'm the American side. I'm not listening to Trump. It's J.D. Vance. It's not Steve Witkoff. And I say, look, we understand that your main objective is to be, to some extent, reintegrated into the regional and global economy. We understand you want to be able to keep this leverage as an insurance policy in the future. We don't like that, but we understand why you want to keep it. We will acknowledge that in exchange for you no longer engaging with support for the likes of Hezbollah or developing domestic nuclear technology. Would that be enough? And I know this is a strange, perhaps silly question, because we're a million miles away from it right now. There aren't meaningful negotiations as far as we understand. But it seems to me that Iran is willing to make potentially quite major concessions on things like nuclear ambitions for what you just described there. And I think maybe a cardinal ranking of what Tehran is really after would be quite useful here. Because, these aren't the things that are explained actually to a mass audience in the UK right now by legacy media.
Yeah, well, this goes back to, what was the strategic logic for the nuclear program in Iran? And I have long argued that the nuclear program, Iran's approach to developing, its nuclear program, it wasn't a covert, program that was aimed at, dashing for the bomb in some mountain. They wanted to build, the whole nuclear fuel cycle infrastructure, from getting the uranium to the yellow cake to building the centrifuges to being able to position themselves to provide, to develop their own nuclear fuel that they need for the nuclear power plant in Bushehr. But what this gave them was, this threshold capacity. It's a dual use technology. So if they have all these centrifuges and these declared facilities to the international community, to the IAEA, that, if they had, this gave them leverage in their mind. So if they wanted to, dash for the bomb, they can, quickly move to weapons grade uranium and stuff, but they never did that. And so what the program, I think, was a bargaining chip. I mean, it was, aimed at the deterrent function that, we have this threshold capacity, we can dash for the bomb. That didn't work. It was also a bargaining chip where, they showed that they were willing, really ever since 2005, and even before that, in 2003, when Khatami shut down the enrichment program, but that they were willing to trade this threshold capacity for basically strategic accommodation of the Islamic Republic by the great powers, by the US, that since 1979 has been at odds with this system and has pursued sanctions relief in one way. I mean, it's regime change in one way or another. And we can get into that history if you want, but I would argue that is the objective reality of the history of US-Iran relations since 1979. And so, 2015 was a big moment where Iran was willing to give up this bargaining chip in exchange for sanctions relief and the prospect of detente with the US, while at the same time keeping its regional strategic depth, keeping the support for Hezbollah, for Hamas, and that was a big fault, something that many, hawks in the US faulted the deal for. That, Iran is still, we're giving them sanctions relief. Yeah, the nuclear program. I mean, they would argue that the nuclear program wasn't even properly put in check, even though it really was. But, Iran was still supporting these other groups and, building kind of its own sphere of influence in a way in the region. Regardless, now we're in a situation and, a new situation where the Strait of Hormuz has long been something that, people have talked about. Iran couldn't shut it down. It could have all these debilitating knock-on effects, but now they've proven that they can, and they've closed it, despite, as I said, the US throwing everything at them, short of like nuking them or ground invasion. And it's still shut down. They're still launching their missiles. They're still shooting their drones. And this is arguably, many people are arguing this nowadays, that it's a greater deterrent weapon or deterrent kind of means that Iran has, even more so than the nuclear program, even maybe if it had nuclear weapons, because of the global ramifications. So to your point of, what could a deal look like? Will Iran be willing to give up its nuclear program again? I think, the nuclear program, again, viewing it in this bargaining chip idea that the Iranians, I think, had and have had, they were willing, again, to part ways with a lot of these capabilities just before this war. That deal, there was negotiations ongoing just before this war. In Geneva, their last meeting, and according to reports by The Guardian, by Amwaj Media, that there was a deal at hand that was actually stronger for the US than the Obama-era deal. Iran was actually apparently willing to, freeze enrichment, not go back to enrichment in the near term, perhaps in perpetuity. They were going to set up a regional consortium to develop nuclear fuel. So, but that goes to this idea that, they wanted the deterrent function. If they can get a deal, they can get sanctions relief, they can remove the shadow of war from over their heads. They didn't get that with, they didn't get that kind of nuclear deal. But right now, with the Strait of Hormuz potentially changing the strategic landscape, and, the US, that would be a concession to the US giving up the enriched uranium, giving up, maybe some of these nuclear means, going back to that deal that was perhaps on the table. That seems feasible. But, what is not feasible is that, Iran is going to, I think, fight with everything it has to maintain this closure of the Strait of Hormuz, because that is the bigger strategitic prize for them.
That was Sina Toosi speaking to me earlier today. We'll be putting out a longer version of that interview, the full version of that interview, tomorrow. That'll be on this YouTube channel. Before we go on to our next story tonight, as I said earlier on, we have 5 £50 vouchers for our shop to give away. But there's only 6 days left to enter. All you need to do is complete the audience survey by 11:59 p.m., not a minute later, on Sunday, the 12th of April, to be in with a chance of winning. £50, books, t-shirts, tote bags, buy whatever you want. And on another note, bit of housekeeping, we have over 4,000 of you watching tonight, 4,500, really, really impressive. Normally this show goes on for an hour. Evening show, if you're new, from 6 to 7, Monday to Friday. We're going to go an hour and a half tonight because this is a really, really important story to cover. If you like what we're doing, if you like media being done in a different way, frankly, to much of the legacy media, as we'll be finding out with another story in a moment, then why not support us? Go to novaramedia.com/support. Help us build a new media for different politics. We feel like we're moving the dial in holding certain people, certain interests accountable in this country. We're only able to do that with your help. We don't do it via propaganda. We don't do it via telling you what to do. We do it via talking to people, by relaying the news, by examining and investigating current affairs in a way that, frankly, legacy media and the millionaire-controlled press and broadcast media don't want to. So like I say, if that sounds good to you, why not support our work here at Novara Media? Go to novaramedia.com/support. A synagogue is bombed and completely destroyed. At the same time, a residential block next to it is also destroyed, while at least 12 people die over the space of a few hours. But this isn't a terrorist attack against a Jewish place of worship in Britain. Of course, if it was, there would have been immediate condemnation from across the political spectrum, and rightly so. Nor is it in the United States, or elsewhere in Europe for that matter. And those responsible aren't Islamists. Earlier today, US and Israeli forces destroyed the Rafinia synagogue in Tehran. Iran is home to the largest Jewish population in the Middle East outside of Israel. Last year, the Times of Israel said there was still approximately 15,000 Jewish Iranians, with 25 synagogues believed to remain in the country, as well as several kosher restaurants, an old age home, a cemetery, and a Jewish library. There's even an Iranian Jewish newspaper. Jews are, however, subject to several legal limitations in the country, including being barred from holding significant government positions. However, as a religious minority, they're entitled to a seat in Iran's parliament, the Majlis, which is reserved for a Jewish representative. Here is Morjan Yashai, an Iranian Jew, outside the destroyed synagogue earlier today.
خانم یشایی، ما الان در کنار کنیسه رفینیا هستیم، یکی از اماکن مقدس کلیمیان ایران که در حمله هوایی تخریب شده. من از شما به عنوان یه عضو فعال جامعه کلیمی ایران یه سوال دارم. شما چرا ایرانو دوست دارید؟ چرا ایرانو ترک نکردید تا حالا؟
ببینید، کلیمیان بیش از 2500 ساله در ایران هستند. ما همراه بقیه هموطنانمون وقایع تاریخی زیادی رو از سر گذروندیم. بالا و پایین‌های این کشور در گوشت و خون و ژنمون وارد شده. من واقعا اینجا رو که می‌بینم، درسته که یک تعلق خاطر شخصی نسبت بهش دارم، ولی با بقیه ویرانه‌های کشورم هیچ تفاوتی برام نمی‌کنه.
Now, if you're listening along on the podcast, Morjan is asked why she, as a Jew, is staying in Iran. She answers that the Iranian Jewish community has been there for 2,500 years. They've gone through a lot of historical events together with the rest of Iranian society. She adds that she has a relationship with her country, Iran, and not with any other. The country, she says, has entered our flesh and blood. You heard that word there, kalimia. Kalimi, in Persian, is a very polite, formal way of saying a Jewish person. You can say Yehudi, but kalimi is a nice way of saying it. It means literally somebody who's spoken with God. So think about that for a moment. There's a Jewish Persian lady, Iranian Jew, you can, whatever formulation you like. I don't know where she's from in Iran. She could be Azeri, but I think it sounds like she's from Tehran. And she is outside a synagogue. There's 25 of them in Iran. And she's saying that the country is in her blood. And the gentleman she's speaking to is using that word, kalimi, kalimiyah. One who has spoken with God. It's from a surah in the Quran. And the first synagogue that has been destroyed in Iran wasn't by terrorists. It wasn't by fanatics, although, of course, it was a different kind of fanatic. It wasn't destroyed by Salafists. It was destroyed by the Israeli and US Air Forces. The first one. We've had synagogues attacked in the US, in France, in Britain. The first one in Iran wasn't done by people inside Iran. That makes you think, given that we're told incessantly by our media that Iran wants to genocide everybody in Israel, that it's inherently anti-Semitic. Which again, I'm sure there are many anti-Semites in Iranian society. Of course there are. There are lots in this country as well, if you care to look. But it has the second largest population of Jews in the Middle East. They're their own newspaper. Hard to square, isn't it? The reality with the story, which is, Iran is developing nuclear weapons not as a means of leverage or a bargaining chip, as Sina Toosi tells me in that interview, which you can of course watch tomorrow, They want nukes because they want to kill every single Israeli Jew and they want to recreate the Holocaust as quickly as possible.
I think what this underscores, first and foremost, Aaron, is that Israel is willing to sacrifice the safety of Jews if it suits their political ends. There's always been this claim by the State of Israel that it is the only safe haven in the world for Jews, and that's why Jews need to go there. But actually, there are countless instances of Jews being put in danger all over the world every day, actually, by the State of Israel's actions. And this, no doubt, I'm sure, well, I don't know whether this was an error or not, but either way, it is a good example of how Jews are also pawns in Israel's games of regional attempts at regional dominance. And we see it when Israel plays fast and loose with anti-Semitism. I've said it before on this show. No one and nothing takes anti-Semitism less seriously than the State of Israel. And actually, I think this is a small example of how no one and nothing takes the safety of Jews more broadly seriously than the State of Israel, if that safety isn't conducive to its own political, ideological ends. And I think that really is useful in exposing Zionism as a political ideology, as a political project.
I mean, I've said this many times. Benjamin Netanyahu is the most secular political leader in the world, right? And what do I mean by that? The god of revisionist Zionism, the god that he worships effectively is the ethnos of Israel, this ethnic group. That is not religion. That is not a religion. That is a form, you could even call it a form of idolatry, right? You're not subordinate to God, actually, you're venerating a certain group of human beings above all others. This ethnic group matter more than everyone else. Everyone else can die to protect this ethnic group. That's not religion. And if you actually know anything about Islam, and I'm not Muslim, I read the Quran about 25 years ago, but if you know anything about Islam, you'll know that it has very deep connections to both Judaism and Christianity, right? So the Kaaba in Mecca, that is actually associated with Abraham, okay? Or Jesus Christ is viewed actually as a very important figure in Islam who is actually going to come back, right? Islam's relationship to Jesus Christ is actually more faith-based than Judaism's is. Islam and Judaism share some things in terms of, consumption of meat. There are certain things that are relatively similar. When it comes to Jesus Christ and the Virgin Mary, actually Islam and Christianity are close to one another. Of course, you won't know any of this because none of this is relayed in our political media culture. Kieran?
Final point on this. What such an aggressive political project claiming to be and to speak for Jewishness and Judaism does, as well as everything else that we've just talked about, is it erases entire cultural histories within Jewish history. So it erases, many people watching this will be surprised to know that there are any Jews inside Iran. That's a form of erasure. And it's perpetuated not by the state of Iran, it's perpetuated by the State of Israel. There are countless other examples. There's an entire subsection of the ethnic group, the Jewish ethnic group, Mizrahi, that came from Iraq, Syria, other parts of the Middle East, to Israel in 1948 and after. Some of them were compelled to go, some of them were compelled by the State of Israel to come. Some of them were economic migrants. All of these histories are melted down and reconstructed as a single Israeli Jewish Zionist history by the State of Israel that aggressively erases all of that complex, often beautiful history in those other places.
I want you to think about this, really. Netanyahu is the most secular leader in the world. I really believe this. He's entirely driven by secular concerns. It might be a media organisation, but there's nothing the BBC loves more than positioning itself as the country's moral authority. Its ethical arbiter, frequently touting their eternal loyalty to notions of balance, objectivity and impartiality. The corporation wants one and one thing only: your trust, the trust of the British public. Why, though? Why does trust matter so much to the BBC? Well, in wartime, there's nothing more valuable than trust, especially if you're in the business of manufacturing consent for British interests, which are also often the interests of its allies like the US and Israel. We saw what was, in our view, a perfect example of this on the BBC website on Monday. "We're sinking deeper," the article headline announced. That's a quote from an Iranian featured in the piece, which is about how the country's residents are bracing for the infrastructure strikes threatened by Donald Trump. It's written by BBC News Persian's senior reporter, Goncher Habibiazad. The article starts off with this. "Ordinary Iranians have been responding to US President Donald Trump's threat to destroy Iran's power plants and bridges unless it opens the Strait of Hormuz. Except you have to go a few paragraphs down to learn it's not necessarily ordinary Iranians the BBC has been speaking to." It then says this. "The BBC has managed to talk to several Iranians, all opposed the current establishment, even though it's very difficult to contact people inside Iran due to an internet blackout imposed by the authorities more than 5 weeks ago." So, the views in the article, despite what the headline says, aren't the views of ordinary Iranians, which you'd expect to be relatively mixed. Instead, they're the views of one part, an important part, but just one part, of Iranian society. And some of those views were very striking. This, according to the article, is what one anti-government Iranian said about the prospect of more intense US and Israeli attacks on their country. Radin, also in his 20s and living in Tehran, said, quote, "About them hitting energy infrastructure, using an atomic bomb, or levelling Iran, my honest reaction is that I'm okay with all of those." So allegedly, you have an Iranian telling the BBC they don't mind being nuked. And that quote was posted online with thousands of readers expressing their incredulity. Criticism of it racked up 13,000 likes and 350,000 views in a matter of hours. No wonder. It seems like a complete fabrication or the statement of a total lunatic. Center Iranian voices, they're asking to be nuked. Who are you to explain against what they really want? I can see the viral Instagram videos now. And it was one that strangely echoed comments made by Donald Trump on Monday.
You've said Iranians would be mad if you stopped these attacks, but why would they want you to blow up their infrastructure, to cut off their power? Wouldn't that be punishing Iranians for the actions of the regime?
They would be willing to, and it's suffering, they would be willing to suffer that in order to have freedom. The Iranians have, and we've had numerous intercepts. Please keep bombing. Bombs that are dropping near their homes. Please keep bombing. Do it. And these are people that are living where the bombs are exploding. And when we leave and we're not hitting those areas, they're saying, please come back, come back, come back. These are the people. I don't know what they do. All I can tell you is they want freedom.
Sure, many Iranians may want freedom. They might want a loosening of certain social restrictions. They might want to drink alcohol. They might want political reform of one kind or another, or maybe even a different system of government. But getting nuked isn't going to achieve any of that. Now, the BBC responded to the criticism they received online, though very, very quietly, changing Radin's quotes to this. Radin, also in his 20s and living in Tehran, said, "If attacking targets in the country brings down the Islamic Republic, I'm fine with that, because if the Islamic Republic survives this war, it will stay forever." The article appears to have been changed on Monday night, not a minor change, a very substantial change. It's a quote, remember, and one clearly in response to the BBC's audience finding the original unbelievable, frankly. And yet no correction appeared on the article until today, when the BBC published this. Update, 7th of April. This article originally included a longer quote from Radin, in which he spoke about the attacks on Iranian energy infrastructure and referred to the levels of destruction which he suggested would be personally acceptable to him to bring down the Islamic Republic. Radin's comments were made directly to the BBC and were initially included in full to illustrate the strength of feeling of some of those who opposed the country's leadership. However, after further review, this part of the quote was removed from the article due to concerns over the way in which the speaker expressed his views and the extent to which they reflected wider Iranian viewpoints. Well, none of the article reflects wider Iranian viewpoints, for one thing, as the author admits when she says the quotes only came from one side, people who oppose the government. Now, we wrote to the BBC here at Novara Media. We sent them several questions. We asked them to verify that their "nuke me" quote in the original article was a sourceable and accurate quote given to their journalist. It's a pretty big claim, and it adds a veneer of legitimacy to horrors. We asked them to explain why quotes from pro-government or even anti-intervention Iranians were not included in the article. It's not like they're impossible to find. And we asked whether there is a general editorial guideline, formal or informal, in place against speaking with pro-government civilian Iranians. We received an answer that addressed none of these legitimate queries, we think so anyway, getting this boilerplate response instead. This BBC News article originally included a longer quote from Radin, in which he spoke about attacks on Iranian energy infrastructure and his own views on the Iranian regime. All his comments were made directly to the BBC and were initially included in full to illustrate the strength of feeling of some of those who are opposed to the country's leadership. However, after further review, part of his quote was removed due to concerns over the way in which the speaker expressed his view and the extent to which they reflected wider Iranian viewpoints. On 7th of April, an update was added to the online article highlighting this change to readers. We apologise that this wasn't done when the change was initially made. Basically, they just gave us their correction. And in neither of those, the public correction or what they sent to us, is there any mention of nukes, right? There's no mention of nukes, atomic weapons. And this is extraordinary. It is one of the most insane, deranged quotes I've ever seen from the BBC, ever. I can honestly say that. This is not hyperbole. Somebody saying they want their country to be nuked, or they're indifferent. Actually, let's be honest. They're indifferent to their country being nuked, is an extraordinary assertion. They've then changed that quote. It's one thing to change it. They've changed it without even adding a correction or an editorial note. Here at Novara Media, if we change an article, let alone a quote, if we change an article, even if we just maybe amend something grammatically or make something clear by changing a phrase around, we have a note. If we do that multiple times, we have multiple notes. I find it extraordinary that Novara Media, which I care about deeply, of course, I helped start the thing, but I find it extraordinary that Novara Media, in this case, has higher editorial standards than the BBC when reporting on a war and seemingly legitimising the deployment of nuclear weapons on civilian populations. I find that extraordinary. Kieran, this is a really important story in a number of ways. I want to delve in a little bit deeper to the actual journalist in a minute, but it's almost like the BBC saying, we're not actually interested in fair, impartial journalism. It's as close as you can get to them saying, in my view, this is propaganda. We only spoke to one side, and they said something crazy, and then we changed it, and we didn't even say we changed it.
Yeah. Maybe about 4 years ago, I might have naively said to you, Aaron, oh, well, the BBC often confuses impartiality for neutrality, as Gary Lineker, of all people, ingeniously pointed out. And I'm sure that there's some of that goes on in the organisation, with some inaccurate reporting, this sense of, well, we need to try and find a middle ground. Our job is not to say whether it's raining or not, it's to find a middle ground between rain and no rain. Then, of course, the Gaza genocide happened, and the BBC's sort of steadfast unwillingness to report on what's happening in a way that treats the Palestinians as human beings. And I think that was probably a huge eye-opener. I probably wouldn't have said the neutrality pass that, but just assume I would have. I think that was a huge eye-opening thing for a lot of people as concerns the BBC and its willingness to substitute the reality for a political agenda. The BBC has a political agenda. It has a political agenda because of the people in it, because of the kinds of people that get filtered into the BBC and work for it. It has a political agenda for a wider reason, which is that it's embedded in a society and it wants to please powerful interests. And it's fearful of powerful interests, by the way. That's not to make an excuse for the BBC. The BBC is fearful of powerful interests. It's fearful that private actors, entities, will go to the next government, say that's a reform government, and it will get them to defund the BBC or destroy the BBC. Now, that's, again, I'm not making any excuses, but those are clear pressures which create a political agenda for the BBC to report on things in a certain way. And I would argue the BBC has a terrible record domestically as well, in domestic British politics, with this kind of thing. Austerity and manufacturing consent for that. And so we don't need to go into all that. But what I would say is that actually on foreign policy, the BBC has a much more strident and stringent political agenda. You know, it's like an official heresy to say something against Israel. It's an official heresy to go against a war. Andrew Marr, the famous clip that we played on this show before, Michael talked about it. Andrew Marr talking about the war in Iraq being a victorious thing several months into the war in Iraq. He was only the BBC's most senior political correspondent, of course, totally irrelevant. Now that he's rowed back on it after 1 million people have died, it's all fine, isn't it? I mean, these things have real consequences. And so I put it back to you, Aaron, but trying to manufacture consent for a potential nuclear war is about as grave as anything as you can possibly imagine a news corporation or anything else doing.
Yeah. On the one hand, it's crazy, but on the other hand, it represents a complete continuation of everything they've already done.
Right.
It represents a complete continuation. It's totally predictable. I think many people in this country genuinely think that the majority of Iranians want to be bombed. They genuinely believe that. They genuinely think the majority of Iranians want to not have clean drinking water, that steel and energy should be destroyed. Because all they see when they see Iranians in the media is Omar Jalili doing, Sandy Hook-style trutherism for the schoolgirls killed at Minab by the Israelis in the US, or actually probably the US Air Force from what we know. Or they see people on the Piers Morgan show who have literally no idea what they're talking about, like Elika Labon, with these ridiculous talking points about how actually 90% of Iranians want regime change. I mean, I can tell you right now, that's not true. It's not true. The Conservative candidate at the last Iranian election got 13 million votes. Add some more to that too. So at a minimum, it's twice that. At a minimum, I think it's far more than that personally. I think it's probably a third for, a third against, and a third in the middle. And the third in the middle, guess what happens to them when their country is literally bombed by foreigners? What do you think happens? What would happen in this country? If there's a Tory PM, and if Nigel Farage was the Prime Minister, I didn't like the guy, and we start getting bombed, what do you think I'm going to do? Yeah, get rid of Farage. By the way, this is a country that's sandwiched between Iraq and Afghanistan. They know what a failed state can look like. They've got Syria not far away. They take these things seriously. And I do think, frankly, it was very predictable. I think it was a matter of time. By the way, I think it'll happen again. I think we'll have people in the media saying that they want to be nuked. Center Iranian voices. Wake up. Listen to Iranians. They're saying we want to be nuked. It was a matter of time. Kieran.
Final thing on that. I totally agree with everything you said. And actually, the fact that audiences in this country, to the degree that they are susceptible to it, speaks to a very specific kind of racism. Let's call it what it is. It's a continuation of the imperial core dismissing colonial subjects as not three-dimensional, as not multi-dimensional people who actually want life and liberty in the same way that those in the imperial core want life and liberty. And when you dismiss the manufacturing of consent starts much earlier. When you start saying death cult, death cult, death cult, you synonymize this death cult platitude with Iran or with Gaza, then you start to see the people in those places as part of that death cult. They want death. They like death. It's a trope about the whole area. I know a lot of people in the Iranian diaspora say we're not Arabs, but through the prism of white European racism, it makes no difference. If you're brown, you're part of that death cult in that shithole part of the world, as they say, in inverted commas. That's it. It's as simple as that. And it doesn't matter how many news shows you go on begging for your country to be bombed from Connecticut or California. It's not going to change the way that they see you. They're going to see you as part of that morass. And one final thing I would say about that is, you can find 1 million quotes to back this up. This one's about the Palestinians, but it could just as easily be about the Iranians. Golda Meir, one of the most, I think, I've read many, many, many quotes by Israeli statespeople that I find utterly deplorable. And I think maybe one of the most deplorable I've ever read, one that stands out in my mind most, is Golda Meir saying we can forgive them for killing our children, but we cannot forgive them for making us kill their children, talking about the Palestinians. That's the mentality. And then, of course, it gets adapted into they use children as human shields. This mind mulch, this nonsense with absolutely no bearing in reality spreads.
We had Patrick Christie's from GB News on X earlier on, sharing videos of women and children going to various infrastructure sites as effectively human shields. And he's saying that this is evil, they're being forced to go. There's no evidence of them being forced to go. Maybe some people are. We have absolutely no evidence of it. They seem perfectly happy to be there. Again, I'm not saying that's the majority of the country. It may be a slim minority of the country, but those people seemingly want to be there. And I said to him, these people are willing to sacrifice themselves to their country. They know that if the grid goes down and clean water goes down and schools go down and universities go down, they're not going to have a country left. And they want to do their bit. And if you can pick up an AK-47 and you can fight, you're not going to do that. You're going to fight. Those people, a 30-year-old mum with 2 kids, can't fight. That's the sacrifice she feels that she can make. And I find it so interesting that the exact same people who would commend patriotism, people willing to sacrifice themselves to their country, when it's in Britain, you're the best of the best. But if it's a brown person willing to die for their country, if they're a patriotic person, if they're not just patriotic, but they're intelligent and strategic, which some elements of the Iranian state certainly have been in recent weeks, surprisingly so for the White House, surprisingly so for our media, they literally can't understand it. Not just can they not understand it, you're evil. So you get this incredible flip from Churchill, we'll fight them on the beaches, venerated. This is the apex of bravery and courage. But if an Iranian says that, we'll fight them on the beaches, this person is evil and human shields and they're a monster and we must kill them. I mean, wind this back, we are seeing the insinuation of the deployment of nuclear weapons against the country in the name of stopping them getting a nuclear weapon. Hundreds of years from now, people will look at this and they'll laugh. They'll say, what the hell? Who was so wrapped up in this nonsense to believe it? Many people do. Fewer than before, thank goodness, but many people do. Kieran, we're going to stick with the story just for one moment because I think this is a really important detail. This journalist, Gonsheh Habibizadeh, worked, it should be said, with Marjan TV. That's an outlet founded by expat regime change activists. She also worked for its subsidiary, Manoto TV, which has been described by Iranian academic Shahab Esfandiari as a, quote, pro-monarchy network with the mission of glorifying the Pahlavi dynasty, one of the worst dictatorships of the 20th century. In my opinion, that's all true. She's written also many articles for The Guardian. In a Guardian article on the Women Life Freedom protests, she claimed that Iranian police were shooting female protesters in the genitals. Instead of concrete evidence, she turned to a network of opposition-aligned doctors who insisted that security forces decided to shoot at the faces and private parts of women because they have an inferiority complex. Again, there's no evidence of this. We can't say things with any certainty. We're not there. But when you make these kinds of claims, you need a high threshold. And this particular journalist has now done this in multiple outlets in the UK media. This is in Grey Zone. Habibizadeh suggested her allegations had been confirmed by others. Quote, when our article was published, there were more people I saw that had the courage to also share their stories of how they were hit. However, most of them were anonymous users on Twitter. Her words. She's currently the BBC Persian senior reporter and freely admits she has no contact whatsoever with any Iranians who support the government and communicates exclusively with anti-government figures instead. Quote, all those I talked to inside Iran are against the current establishment, she revealed on April 4th. This is in Grey Zone. Now, as a journalist, you're entitled to do that. You can have a YouTube channel doing that, right? You could even be at the Daily Mail or the Times and do that, have an agenda. You're regulated, but fine. She's doing this for the BBC. This is meant to be public interest journalism. So you have an Iranian, she's born in Iran, she's come here, she wants to pursue journalism. That's fine, that's good, right? I'm half Iranian. She's worked for one outlet, which is pro-regime change. She's then gone to The Guardian, falling short of journalistic standards, frankly. She's then gone to the BBC and doing the same in the context of a war on Iran. Now, this is really important. These are very high stakes. And she's dehumanizing a whole country, frankly. And it adds legitimacy to the kinds of things which otherwise people wouldn't accept. What do you think is going through her mind when she does this kind of journalism?
Well, that's a very, very different.
Do you think she
question.
believes? This is a speculative question.
Yeah.
But do you think people can become so motivated with their political cause that they think they're doing impartiality when she has overtly said, "I only speak to one side"?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose a generous interpretation is that she has been radicalized by the pro-monarchist Iranian diaspora, let's put it like that, to such an extent that all of her kind of critical faculties have fallen away. And that when she gets, but I mean, she's a journalist, she's a senior journalist.
At the BBC,
I
right?
mean, that's the most generous interpretation. I'll come to the ungenerous interpretation in a second, which I actually think is the accurate one. The generous interpretation is that she has now eroded her critical faculties because she has spent so long in pro-monarchist Iranian diaspora circles, has maybe, seen offences committed by the regime, whatever, in Iran, and as a result has lost the ability to discern between things that meet basic journalistic standards and things that don't. And by the way, just on that, you're absolutely right. When we questioned the 30 or 40,000 figure, the Iranian regime killed 30 to 40,000 people, as is claimed in the days.
Well, Trump said 45. Just to be clear, Trump said 45,000.
45,000, yeah. All we're doing is asking for the proof, and there is no proof. Every time I've tried to find the proof, I always hit a brick wall. And the brick wall is it's a Saudi-funded group that's making that estimate. You mentioned Elika Lebon. I saw her the other day saying, well, it was the hospitals. The people in the hospitals were reporting that. There's no evidence of that. Nobody has captured those claims anywhere from doctors and nurses directly in anything like the numbers that amount to anything approximating 45,000 or 40,000 or 30,000. All we're doing is asking for them to surmount the traditional burden of proof, which is if you're going to claim something, prove it. We're not saying it didn't happen. It's impossible. We're saying, no, you simply have to meet the burden of proof. And if we're going to, if anybody's going to give their consent to bombing a country, which I certainly wouldn't, but if you're going to give consent, then of course the need for that burden of proof becomes even more extreme. It's as simple as that. The ungenerous interpretation, briefly, Aaron, is that she is committed to either to the Iran becoming a failed state, ostensibly her home country becoming a failed state. More likely, she's committed to regime change at all costs and is willing to sacrifice or is willing to bend the truth so that people are sacrificed in Iran in order to achieve that regime change. This is conjecture, but only one of those outcomes, I think, only one of them could be true, but one of them, I suppose, in some form must be true.
And by the way, it's a free country. You can do that, right? You can be a mouthpiece for whoever you like. You can't do it with the BBC. That's the whole point. Yeah. And I should also say, that number about 45,000 people dying, there is no evidence for it. The best sources that you could look at are saying 7,500. By the way, still many people.
Yeah, terrible.
The Iranian government says 5,000, worse than Tiananmen Square. I mean, they would say that actually it was an uprising supported by external forces. There is some truth to that. And 5,000 people includes many people who are caught in crossfire or police officers, besieged, etc. Regardless, 45,000 people in 2 days is more people than died in the British Army in the first month of the Battle of the Somme. So I think anybody with any kind of common sense would immediately question that. And the fact that it's not by the media tells you a lot, right? And as you say, maybe 45,000 people did die. There's no evidence for it. And even reliable organizations who are not amenable to the regime, amenable to the Iranian state, based in the US, are saying 7,500. Other people say 3,000. The government, like I say, says 5,000. Now, you might be saying, people are dying. What difference does it make? I think they're saying 45,000 precisely so. 100,000 people dying in the weeks and months ahead doesn't sound so bad. Oh, well, there was a failed state. We turned Iran into Afghanistan. There's a civil war, but it started because they killed 45,000 people. It's inflated for a reason. Very similar story to the alleged beheading of babies in October 2023. And my own colleagues, Owen Jones, Michael Walker, Ash Sarkar, very prominently said, we need evidence for this. This is really important, not least because that would be horrific, but also there is a retaliation right now from Israel, and they're using that as the ethical basis to be vicious. When they kill children, they're saying, well, they beheaded babies, so an eye for an eye. Well, actually, it turns out that was completely made up. Never happened. And if you asked whether or not it was true in the opening days 10 weeks afterwards, you were called all manner of things. But actually, you were right to do that. And that's why I'm really happy to say I need evidence to see the 45,000 figure. This is really important. History can't repeat itself. Kieran, I had a great show tonight. How are you feeling?
Also, like we had a great show. Obviously, some very, very difficult topics, but that's just the way it is these days. Every week we cover very difficult topics. How many people have we retained?
We've still got 4,000 people with us.
Beautiful. Well, thank you to each and every one of them. And I suppose see you next week is in order.